The wind bites hard on the high plains of memory, and the past has a way of cutting through like snow against raw skin. Before we step into tonight's tale, I'll ask you something plain. If you're hearing my voice and walking this road with us, do me the kindness of pressing that like button. Leave a comment to tell us where in the wide world you're listening from, and subscribe to this channel so these frontier stories keep reaching hearts that need them. Out here, words are scarce and hard won, and your small act of presence is how we keep the fire lit. Now, Arizona Territory, January of 1882. Picture it in your mind. Land smothered under a crust of ice and silence, sky iron gray and heavy. The last rays of the sun buried behind mountains that looked more like tombstones than peaks. No birds, no movement, only the sound of boots crunching through brittle snow and the breath of a woman who had nearly none left to give. Her name was Tala, Apache born, though her people had cast her out for a crime that was no crime at all. The mark against her was not bloodshed, not theft, not treachery, merely the mistake of speaking too long to a white man who had shown her kindness. One blanket traded, one conversation shared, and suddenly she bore the shame of exile. To her uncle she was a curse, to her cousin a warning, to the elders an unwanted weight. And so she was turned out, banished into the cruelest winter the mountains had known in years. Bare feet tore open against the frozen crust. Each step left a smear of red behind her, proof she was still alive, if only barely. The cotton dress clung in rags, a garment sewn for desert sun, not snow that fell sideways. Hunger fogged her mind. She no longer thought in clear lines, only in fragments, only in voices. Her uncle's condemnation, her cousin's taunt, the elder's final words. You do not belong here anymore. And yet the body pressed forward. Every woman knows there comes a moment when pride bows to survival. Tala had reached that moment long before her knuckles touched wood, long before she raised her head to look into the eyes of the man who opened the cabin door. He was taller than she expected, lean, scarred. His weight shifted to one side as though the earth itself had wounded him, and he carried the limp as both burden and companion. His name, she would learn, was Calder Ridge. A man hollowed by grief, left alone in a shack of wood and smoke at the edge of the forest. He had lost a wife to death, and with her, the last of his ties to town. What remained was work, silence, and the fire that cracked each night like the voice of memory refusing to go out. Tala's lips trembled, words falling from her like stones tossed into the dark. Please, don't let me die out here. And then, with the weight of humiliation pressing her voice flat, she gave the only currency she thought a man might accept. I could be a good wife to you. Those words were not truth, not promise, only desperation shaped into syllables, a woman with nothing left to bargain but herself. And though her heart clenched at the shame of speaking them, her eyes held steady. Better to risk rejection than to perish unseen in a ditch of snow. Calder did not leer, did not bargain, did not speak at all. His gaze traveled down, bloodied feet, bruised legs, neckline torn by cold and hunger, and then back up again. His eyes did not soften, but they did not harden either. He simply stepped back, the door opening wide enough for her to pass through. Inside, the cabin breathed warmth. Fire hissed in the iron stove. The air carried pine smoke and the smell of rabbit stew. She staggered once, knees buckling, and his hand steadied her elbow. Nothing more, no claim, no grasp, just enough to keep her standing. Ida, he gave her stew in a tin bowl and she drank it with both hands. grease dripping down her chin. She did not care for manners. Hunger was stronger than shame. He gave her wool folded and smelling faintly of pine, and she wrapped it around her shoulders like the skin of a new life. When her eyes flickered shut, he rose, stripped the top blanket from his cot, and pointed to the bed. "Sleep," he said, his first word to her. And so the night began, not with vows or bargains, but with silence shared between strangers. Tala lay on the cot, tears burning behind her eyelids, not from pain, but from the unfamiliar weight of being helped without demand. Calder sat in his chair, coat still on, rifle within reach, sleep a shallow thing. Outside, the wind dragged itself over the frozen ridges. Inside, the fire steadied. In that quiet room, something unspoken stirred. Not yet trust, not yet safety, but the faint outline of both. For Tala, it was the first breath in weeks that did not taste of fear. For Calder, it was the first time in years he had opened a door and not regretted it. Yeah, this is where our story begins. With a woman too proud to beg, but forced to, and a man too broken to hope, but still decent enough to act. Together, they stood at the edge of ruin and choice, and neither yet knew how deeply that one open door would change them both. The silence of that cabin did not stay hollow. What began as the quiet of strangers soon deepened into something else. A rhythm measured not in words, but in the weight of small mercies. The second night came colder than the first, snow pressing against the walls like an animal testing its cage, and Tala woke with the ache of frostbite still gnawing at her feet. She sat up slow, pulling the wool tighter, and found him there, Calder Ridge, half asleep in his chair, rifle leaned against the wall, boots still laced as if he never allowed himself the indulgence of rest. His face was carved by years, jaw dark with stubble, eyes sunk deep as canyons. He looked like a man who had given up on kindness, and yet here he was, watching over her. She realized then what unsettled her most. He had taken nothing. She had offered herself in shame, believing that was the only coin she had left to spend, and he had refused without refusing, letting her keep both her body and her choice. That was a wound of its own kind, a cut she didn't know how to bleed. She pressed her lips tight and busied her trembling hands with the blood-soaked rags at her feet. The pain of cleaning frostbitten flesh drew fire into her throat, but she kept silent. Still, Calder stirred, rising stiff and slow, the limp showing in his step. Without ceremony, he set salve and linen on the floor beside her. "I'm going to hurt you," he said, his voice rasping like a shovel against gravel. And then, after a pause, he added, "You do it." It took her a long breath to understand he would not touch her unless she chose it. That gift of control was heavier than any blanket. She took the tin in shaking hands, working ointment into ruined skin, feeling the sting and the burn, but also the strange calm of tending her own wounds in a place where no one rushed her or raised a hand against her. She had not known what relief tasted like until that moment. It was bitter, sharp, and almost too much to swallow. Calder sat back down, poured whiskey into a tin cup, and took up a block of pine with his knife. The blade moved steady, wood curling in soft strips to the floor. She glanced at him between clenched teeth, expecting a trap, a question, a demand. A nun came. He carved, she tended her feet, and the silence was no longer punishment. It was space. By the third morning, Tala's hunger had steadied into a rhythm of its own. He hunted, she boiled water, and their work moved like two parts of one machine. She swept the floor without being told, She lit the fire before he returned. She mended his torn shirt with thread found in a rusted tin, folding it neat, as though offering proof she was more than a burden. When she placed the shirt on the table beside him, he looked at it once, nodded, and said, "You can stay." 3 words, rough as dry bark, but to her they struck deeper than any vow. She lay that night with her heart pounding in her chest, not from fear, but from the strangeness of belonging somewhere. Even if just for a day longer, Calder slept in his chair again, as if the cot were hers by right, not loan. Their silence became its own language. In the snowfields, he showed her how to set traps, and when she stumbled on the incline, he offered a hand without words. She took it, pulled herself up, and let go quick. But the warmth lingered in her palm long after. At the woodpile, she swung the hatchet, clumsy at first, then steadier, and when her arms shook from fatigue, he said nothing, just picked up the split piece and stacked it. That, too, was a kind of praise. Her body ached each night, but it was an ache with meaning, not shame. She hummed under her breath as she worked, the sound faint like a bird testing broken wings. Calder never told her to stop. One evening, after stew and silence weeks, she noticed the block of wood in his hands had become something more, a comb, shaped with care, the teeth thin and even, the edges smoothed by hours of patience. She stared until he placed it in her palm. "Your hair's always in your eyes," he said. Simple words, but her throat tightened. No man had ever handed her something made for her sake alone. She dragged the comb through her knots, wincing as strands pulled free. And when she looked up, he had turned away, as though the gift embarrassed him more than her gratitude. She held the comb like it was carved from bone, from memory, from mercy itself. That night she spoke softly by the fire, testing the weight of words she hadn't trusted in weeks. "You lost someone." He didn't turn. "My wife," he said, "5 winters." She nodded, her eyes falling to the wool shirt that hung loose over her shoulders. "I lost people too. Not to death, but it feels the same." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt her voice break open. "I'm not trying to take her place." His reply was as steady as his carving. "I know." The air between them shifted. She admitted she didn't want to leave. He said simply, "You don't have to." And there it was, the first tether not bound by desperation but by choice. She rose, heart hammering, and asked him to sit beside her. He did, stiff in the leg but steady. She touched his hand, rough knuckles cold under her fingers, and leaned in. The kiss was gentle, almost clumsy. But it was hers to give, not his to take. When he kissed her back, slow and sure, she felt something uncoil inside her chest. "I feel safe here," she whispered. His answer came without hesitation. "You are." That night he stayed near, her hand tangled with his until sleep pulled them both under. No promises spoken, no bargains drawn, just the silence of 2 people who had chosen, for the first time in too long, not to be alone. Morning came soft, pale light straining through the frost-laced window panes, and the hush of the forest pressed against the cabin walls. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else now, something steadier, shaped by hands that had begun to trust. Tala woke with his hand still tangled in hers, the fire long since fallen to embers. The wool blanket pulled high over their shoulders. She lay still, her breath calm, not from exhaustion, but from the rarest of feelings, safety. The raw fear that had driven her to his door had softened into something slower, heavier, a rhythm of belonging she had not thought possible. Calder stirred beside her, eyes opening to the gray dawn. And though his face carried the weight of years, there was no regret in it, no shadow of doubt. They rose quietly, separate but not apart, each tending to the morning, as though this routine had been theirs for seasons, not days. That day shaped itself like the days before. Wood chopped, traps checked, fire stoked, but with one difference. She no longer moved like a guest waiting to be turned out. She swept the floor without being asked, boiled water in the tin pot, and hummed low under her breath, a sound that made the cabin walls seem less brittle. Calder watched her once, just once, as she bent over the fire, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. He didn't smile. Not in any plain way, but the tension in his jaw eased. When she caught his eyes, she saw it, and it steadied her in ways words never could. Evenings became their truest language. After the meal, she sewed by the fire with thread pulled from an old tin, mending his worn shirts, while he carved in silence, knife whispering against pine. One night she patched the collar of his best wool, folding it neat and placing it on the table beside him. He looked at it once, nodded, and said the words that anchored her heart. "You can stay." It wasn't much, but it was more than she had been given by her own blood. That night she lay close enough to hear the steady rasp of his breathing, the fire warming her back. And for the first time in months, she slept without dreams of being chased. The days lengthened into a rhythm of quiet cooperation. Calder taught her the land without speaking more than needed. He showed her where the snow bent branches with its weight, where the fox would chew through sinew if the trap was not set right, and how to split kindling so it burned clean. Tala worked beside him, clumsy at first, then steadier, her palms blistering but her spirit lifting. She welcomed the ache in her arms because it was proof that she was alive and useful, not cast aside. When she stumbled climbing a short ridge, he reached out his hand, steady and sure, no lecture, no judgment. She took it, pulled herself up, and let go quickly. But the warmth lingered. Small mercies had begun to weave themselves into a life. On the fourth day, he placed something in her palm, a comb, carved from pine, its teeth smoothed with care. She held it as though it might break, turning it in her hands. "Why?" she asked. His answer was simple as all his words were. "Your hair is always in your eyes." She combed it slowly, wincing at the knots, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, not from pain, but from the weight of being thought of. That night, with the comb still warm in her hand, she asked him if he had lost someone. His reply was quiet, unflinching. "My wife? 5 winters?" She nodded, her own grief heavy in her chest. "I lost people too. Not by death, but it feels the same." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she confessed the truth she had feared he might already know. "I'm not trying to take her place." His answer was steady, patient. "I know." The air between them changed after that. She admitted she didn't want to leave. He said she didn't have to. When she asked him to sit beside her on the cot, he rose stiff with his limp and sat, hands resting on his knees. She reached for his hand, rough and scarred, and placed it in her lap. Then she leaned in, lips brushing his. The kiss was slow, tentative but honest. He kissed her back, steady and sure, and she whispered against his mouth, "I feel safe here." His answer came without hesitation. "You are." That night they slept with their hands still twined, and neither stirred till morning. What followed was not ceremony or promise, but the steady labor of survival made lighter by 2 hands instead of 1. Calder rose before dawn to check the traps, his limp clear in the snow, but his step firm. Tala tended the fire, boiling water, sweeping the cabin. When he returned with game, she cleaned it without flinching, sleeves rolled, her hands steady with the knife. They ate together, not speaking much, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it was full, brimming with the weight of choice. One evening, as she stitched a tear in his trousers and he cleaned the rifle, she studied him across the table. "Why did you let me in?" she asked. He paused, eyes on the ceiling, and answered as though the words cost him something. Didn't see the point in letting you die." Wasn't right. Most people wouldn't care. I'm not most people's simple words, but they struck her harder than any oath. She understood then that his silence was not indifference. It was restraint, a man holding back more than he would ever say. And in that restraint she found safety. As days passed, the lines of loneliness softened. She moved through the cabin with ease, no longer flinching when he drew near, no longer questioning her place. Calder too eased into her presence, his shoulders less tense, his voice less hollow. At night they lay together, no promises spoken, no future drawn, but with the simple truth pressed between them. They were not alone anymore. The snow had not lifted its grip on the land, but something in the cabin had shifted. What once echoed with the hollowness of 2 separate lives now carried the rhythm of a shared breath. The cadence of work, divided and burdens halved. Each morning Calder stepped into the white hush of the forest, limp, steady but unbroken, while Tala stoked the fire and set the pot to boil. Each evening they returned to the circle of the stove, side by side in silence that no longer punished but steadied. They had not spoken of belonging, not in plain words. But the evidence lay in the way she moved now, unhurried, unafraid. As if her body knew before her mind did that she was no longer passing through. The cot was no longer a place she borrowed. It had become theirs, not from vows or bargains, but from the quiet fact that they both returned to it each night and rose from it each dawn. It was in those ordinary hours that something rare began to take shape. Tala swept the floor with steady strokes, boiled water for cleaning, and scrubbed the wooden table until it gleamed in the firelight. Calder repaired the trapdoor to the cellar, wiped his tools clean after each task, and stacked the wood pile in precise rows that calmed him more than any prayer. They did not ask favors of each other. They simply acted, letting their efforts speak louder than words. For Tala, each chore carried the weight of memory. Her mother's voice teaching her how to rinse linens in cold water. Her cousin's laughter in summers when food had been plenty. Those memories ached, but they also steadied her. For Calder, the rhythm of work dulled the sharp edge of grief. Every board nailed straight, every snare checked, was proof that life could still be ordered, still be built, even in the shadow of loss. It was on the 5th morning that she found the comb again, lying on the table where she had left it the night before. She picked it up, running her fingers along the smoothed pine, and felt tears threaten her eyes. He had carved it not as a gift to bind her, but as a gesture that freed her, something made without demand. She tied her hair back with it, then turned toward him. Calder met her gaze for a long moment before looking away, his knife already in hand, working a new block of wood. The silence was not awkward. It was full. That afternoon, they worked outside together. The snow was knee-deep, but Tala moved with determination, stacking wood alongside him. She stumbled once, the hem of her mended dress catching on a root hidden beneath the drift. Calder reached out, steadying her by the elbow, the same way he had the first night she knocked on his door. This time, she did not flinch. She met his eyes, nodded once, and kept going. The touch lingered between them, not in her body, but in the calm that settled in her chest. By evening, they sat across from each other at the table, steam rising from the stew they had made together. She had chopped the roots, he had seared the meat. They ate in silence, but the quiet was no longer empty. When the bowls were cleared, she took his torn shirt from the peg and began to mend it by firelight. He carved again, the wood curling into shavings at his feet. She folded the shirt when finished and placed it gently beside him. His eyes flicked toward it, then toward her, and he gave a short nod. "You can stay," he had said before. Tonight, he did not repeat it, but the truth of those words echoed in every glance, every gesture. Later, as the fire burned low, Tala brushed her hair with the comb he had made. She turned to him, voice soft but steady. "You lost someone." He didn't look up from the wood in his hands. "My wife," he said. His voice held no tremor, only the weight of truth. 5 winters. She lowered her gaze. "I lost people too. Not by death, but it feels the same." The words caught in her throat, heavy with memory, but she forced them out. He set the knife down, meeting her eyes. She whispered the fear that had gnawed at her since the first night. "I'm not trying to take her place." His answer came with the steadiness of a man who did not speak more than needed. "I know." The firelight flickered between them, warming the silence. She leaned forward slightly, her shoulder bare where the wool had slipped, and asked, "Do you miss her?" His eyes did not waver. "Every day." Her throat tightened. "I don't want to leave either," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said. She rose then, heart pounding, and asked him to sit beside her. He did, slow and careful, the limp in his step making the floor creak. He sat at the edge of the cot, hands on his knees, and she reached for his hand, curling her fingers around his rough knuckles. Her lips brushed his, tentative at first, but honest. He kissed her back, not with hunger, but with the weight of a man who had thought himself beyond tenderness. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering, "I feel safe here." His answer was plain, "You are." That night they lay together, her hand resting against his chest, his breath steady against her hair. No vows, no promises, just 2 broken souls finding in each other the smallest proof that life could be chosen again. Outside, the snow fell harder, drumming against the roof, but inside the cabin, the silence was no longer hollow. It was home. The nights lengthened into a rhythm, as steady as the crackle of the stove. And for the first time since snow first swallowed the ridge, the cabin felt lived in rather than endured. Tala's presence filled it not with noise, but with something warmer, a hum beneath the silence that Calder had not felt in years. Her bare feet had once bled across frozen ground. Her voice had once begged through clenched teeth not to be left to die. But now she moved with quiet assurance, her body no longer braced against rejection. She swept floors, boiled water, combed her hair with the pine teeth he had carved. She stitched torn shirts and hummed softly in the firelight, never demanding thanks, never speaking of tomorrow. Calder watched her sometimes, his hands busy with wood or rifle, and found that the weight in his chest was less heavy. Grief still lived in him, his wife's face never far, her absence etched into every scar of memory. but it no longer hollowed him the way it had. He was no longer staring into endless dark. Tala's steady presence lit the room like embers refusing to die. One evening, when the wind rattled the shutters and snow piled high at the sill, Calder set down his knife and spoke words he had not shaped in years. "You miss them still," she said, watching him from across the table, her fingers idly twisting a strip of cloth. His eyes did not lift from the wood shavings at his feet. "Every day." She drew her breath, steadying it. "I lost people too. Not by death, but it feels the same." His gaze rose then, heavy with a sorrow that matched her own. She whispered, almost ashamed, "I'm not trying to take her place." His jaw worked once before he said, plain as stone, "I know." The silence that followed was not brittle. It was thick, binding them. Tala shifted on her chair, the wool shirt slipping from one shoulder, and leaned forward, her voice softer. "I don't want to leave." Calder met her eyes. "You don't have to." That night their bodies spoke what words could not. She kissed him first, gentle but sure, and he kissed her back, steady as a man who had lived too long without tenderness. Their lips met, like two rivers crossing, slow and unhurried. And when she whispered, "I feel safe here," he answered, without hesitation, "You are." They lay together then, not out of need or bargain, but out of choice, the fire burning slow behind them. His hand rested against her back, her breath warm against his chest. And for the first time in years, Calder slept through the night without waking to ghosts. In the days that followed, the rhythm of work grew steadier. Tala no longer asked what needed doing. She simply did it. She swept, boiled, mended, and when Calder returned from his traps with rabbits slung over his shoulder, she took them without question, her hands sure with the knife. He noticed the way she stood by the stove, sleeves rolled, hair combed back neat, the wool shirt loose around her shoulders. She looked not like a beggar at his door, but like a woman who belonged. When she caught him watching, she did not lower her eyes. She held his gaze, steady, and then turned back to her work. One night, Calder finished a carving and set it on the table beside her. Tala picked it up, recognizing the shape before she even held it to the firelight. Another comb, this one smoother, teeth cut finer. She turned it in her hands, her throat tightening. "Is it for me?" she asked. Calder only nodded. "Why?" she pressed. He shrugged, his face unreadable. "Your hair's always in your eyes?" She combed it slowly, carefully, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. "No one ever made me something before," she whispered. Calder said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward her for half a second, and she saw it there, a truth he would not speak, but could not hide. That night, when the fire had burned low, she leaned into him again, lips brushing his with the same quiet honesty as before. They undressed slowly, not with hunger, but with patience, learning the shape of one another without rush. Calder moved like a man unpracticed, unsure but willing. Tala guided him gently, her hands soft against his scars. What passed between them was not transaction, not payment, not escape. It was survival turned into belonging. Afterward, they lay tangled beneath the heavy blanket, her head against his chest, his hand resting against the curve of her waist. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The fire whispered for them, its glow bathing their faces in warmth that neither had known in years. By the end of the week, their lives had braided together as surely as the comb had drawn order through Tala's dark hair. Calder still limped into the snow each morning, rifle slung over his shoulder. But when he returned not to silence, but to her. Tala, once a shadow limping through towns, now moved through the cabin like she was part of its walls. Her hum filling the spaces grief had hollowed out. In the evenings, she mended his trousers by the fire, and he cleaned his rifle across from her. When she set the finished work beside him, he nodded, and when she reached for his hand across the table, he let her hold it. She had come to him with blood on her feet and shame in her voice, offering herself as a wife because she had nothing else to trade. But Calder had not taken her as payment. He had let her in, fed her, clothed her, and slowly given her back what exile had stolen: dignity, control, and the right to choose. Now when she reached for him, it was not in desperation. It was in belonging. And when he kissed her, it was not as a man who pitied her. It was as a man who had found someone worth opening his door for again. The fire had burned low when Tala pressed her face against Calder's chest and whispered the words that had been forming since the day she first crossed his threshold. "You're not like the others." He hadn't answered then, only shifted in his chair as though the sound of it had stirred something long buried. But in the nights that followed, her words hung between them like a lantern in the dark, steadying their steps even as the snow outside grew heavier and the world around them less forgiving. Their lives no longer felt borrowed. The cot, once a place where she clung to blankets for fear of the cold, had become the ground of choice. The bed where they met not as beggar and rescuer, but as man and woman who had decided, quietly, to stop running. Each morning Calder rose first, his limp evident in the creak of the floorboards, but his movements no longer bore the weight of a man carrying grief alone. He stoked the fire, stepped out into the frozen stillness, and returned with traps, heavy with the promise of food. Tala woke to the smell of smoke and snowmelt, her hands quick to boil water, sweep the floor, and ready the cabin for another day's work. She did not wait to be told. She did not ask permission. She had learned the rhythm of this place and found herself woven into it. For Calder, her presence was no longer a question that needed answering. It was an answer already given. It was a quiet rhythm, but it held. Tala learned to read the land as he did, her eyes sharp for the bend of a branch under snow, the faintest of paw prints near a trap. Calder spoke little, only once when something needed saying, and she matched him in that. Their silences layered together like pine needles on the forest floor, soft, steady, and thick enough to hold weight. When she stumbled in the snow, he offered a hand without word or judgment. When he returned with a rabbit slung over his shoulder, she cleaned it with steady fingers. Sleeves rolled, her face composed. Trust had grown there, not in grand declarations, but in the small daily proof of staying. Still, the world beyond their cabin had not forgotten them. On the 7th morning, the sound of hooves broke the still air. Calder heard it first, the limp slowing his step as he crossed the floor to the door. "Inside," he said, his voice flat. Tala obeyed, though her stomach clenched tight. The knock came hard, the kind of knock that carried claim. 3 men on horseback waited beyond the threshold, one draped in a red scarf, another wearing a sheriff's badge that held no real law, and a third with eyes too casual to mean peace. "We're with the Salt Creek watch party," the man in the scarf called. "A word is there's smoke up here." Might be squatters. Heard talk of a woman, too. Calder stood firm, rifle angled at his side. "Ain't squatting. Built this place myself 10 years back. Live alone." His voice didn't waver, though Tala's breath caught in her throat. The men pressed harder, the one with the badge stepping forward, eyes narrow. "We'll take a look around." Calder's jaw set. "You won't." His words hung in the cold like iron. From behind the wall, Tala listened, her heart hammering. She could remain hidden. She could let him carry the lie. But her feet moved of their own accord, her body stepping into the doorway before she could stop herself. "I'm here," she said, voice clear. Calder turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. She lifted her chin. "You don't need to search." The man with the scarf grinned, sharp as a blade. "So you admit it? One of them wild ones, from the mountain bands." His words cut, but Tala did not falter. "I was not anymore. I've hurt no one. I live here," the man sneered, looking to Calder. "Living here now, huh? Oh, that what you call shacking up with a trapper?" Calder stepped forward, rifle steady. "You done?" The grin faltered. "She's not your kind, Ridge." Calder's reply came hard as stone. "She's mine now." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. The men shifted in their saddles, muttering. The false sheriff warned of neighbors, trade, reputation. Calder's answer was colder than the snow. "I gave that up 5 years ago when my wife died. I don't owe this town anything." With that, the men spat into the snow and rode off, though their eyes lingered long enough to promise they would not forget. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Tala turned to him, her breath shaking. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He met her eyes steady. "I know." She swallowed hard. "You could have told them I was gone." Calder's voice did not waver. "I won't ever do that." That night they sat closer to the fire than before, shoulders brushing. She rested her head against his arm and whispered, "You said I'm yours." His hand shifted, calloused fingers brushing her sleeve. "I meant it." She looked up at him, eyes bright. "In the firelight." "Then I'm yours, and you're mine." He did not answer with words. He kissed her instead, slow, sure, sealing what had already been true long before either of them spoke it aloud. For Calder, the declaration weighed less like a burden and more like a release. For Tala, it was the first time in her life she had not been cast aside for wanting to belong. Together, they sat in the glow of the fire, the snow pressing at the cabin walls, knowing that the men would come again. But they also knew something else, something stronger. Whatever came, they would face it together. The fire burned down to coals, but the words they had spoken did not fade. "She's mine now." Calder had said it plain on the porch, rifle steady, voice unshaken. Those 3 words clung to Tala long after the men's hoofbeats had been swallowed by the trees. She had been claimed before, by uncles, by cousins, by elders who had seen her as burden or curse, but never like this. Never with the weight of choice, never with the quiet of protection. She lay against Calder's chest that night, his arm around her, and for the first time since she was cast out, she did not dream of exile. Instead, she dreamed of fire that did not consume, of hands that steadied instead of struck. When she woke to his breath warm against her hair, she knew she would not run. Not now. Not ever. But the ridge did not rest easy. By morning the sky was heavy with more snow, and Calder's face told her plain he expected their peace would not hold. "They'll come back," he said, voice flat as he checked the rifle by the door. Tala met his eyes. "I know." She paused, then asked, "Do you want me to leave before they do?" His answer came without hesitation. "No." She nodded once, the decision settling over her shoulders, like the wool he'd first given her. "Then I'll stay." From then on, the rhythm of their days carried a sharper edge. They worked as before. She swept, boiled, mended, he hunted, chopped, carved. but each task bore the weight of preparation. He sharpened his knives more often, his movements precise, deliberate. She practiced with the small hatchet until her arms trembled, refusing to let weakness show. At night they sat closer by the fire, not speaking of fear, but both feeling it press at the edges of the cabin. When he poured her tea, their shoulders touched. When she rested her head against him, he did not move away. The silence between them had become more than comfort. It had become a vow. One evening, as snow drifted soft against the window, Calder set his cup down and spoke words heavier than any weapon. Sometimes when people get scared, they want someone to blame. You're easy to blame. Tala did not look away. Then what happens now? He met her gaze steady. We prepare. That night they cleaned his rifle together, her hands careful as she followed his instructions. She sharpened his knife while he checked the snare wire. Their movements mirrored each other, two people binding themselves not with rings, but with the steady ritual of survival. It was then, with steel in his hands and firelight on her face, that Calder spoke what he had carried inside since the day she knocked. If they come, I won't let them take you? Tala's throat tightened. They'll say you're hiding me. That you're with me. Calder's eyes did not flinch. I am with you. She blinked hard, fighting tears she hadn't let fall in weeks. You're not afraid? He shook his head. I've lived alone a long time, Tala. I don't want to live that way anymore. Her hand found his on the table, fingers lacing with his. You said you lost everything once, she whispered. So did I. Maybe that means we've got nothing left to lose. Calder studied her, eyes shadowed but burning steady. No, it means we finally got something to protect. She leaned across the table then, kissing him slow. The taste of salt and wood smoke between them. When she pulled back, she pressed her forehead to his and whispered, Then we protected together. The days that followed bore the weight of that promise. Calder checked the traps with rifle slung higher, eyes scanning the tree line. Tala split wood without complaint, arms aching but steady, her breath curling white in the air. They did not speak of fear, but when they met inside, their glances carried it plain. Each night before bed, Calder checked the door, the rifle, the windows. Tala set kindling in the stove and folded their clothes together. When they lay down, her head on his chest, his hand at her back, neither slept easy. But both knew they would wake side by side. It happened at dawn 3 days later. The dogs in the valley below barked first, their sound sharp and echoing against the ridges. Calder was already at the window, rifle in hand, when Tala laced her boots. She stood beside him, face pale but composed. They're coming, she said. He nodded once. Outside, snow cracked under hooves, 4 men this time, the red scarf rider among them, another wearing the false badge, 2 more with rifles loose across their saddles. Calder stepped onto the porch, rifle steady, voice low but iron. You're not welcome here. The man in the scarf smiled, without warmth. You harboring an Apache girl, Ridge? Calder's jaw set. No one here you need to talk to but me. The men shifted, one spitting into the snow. We'll take a look around. Calder's grip tightened. You won't. Then the door opened behind him. Tala stepped out, chin high, coat drawn tight around her shoulders. I'm here, she said clear. Calder turned, eyes flashing, but she laid her hand on his arm. It's all right. She faced the men steady. I was one of the wild ones. Not anymore. I've hurt no one. I live here, that's all. The red scarf man sneered. Living here now, huh? That, what you call, shacking up with a trapper? Calder's voice cut the cold like steel. "She's mine now." The silence that followed was heavy. Horses shifting, men muttering. The sheriff-looking one warned of reputation, neighbors trade. Calder's reply was plain and sharp. "I gave that up when my wife died. I don't owe this town anything the riders left, but not without threats in their eyes." When the sound of hooves faded, Tala turned to him, her hand still on his arm. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her eyes steady. "I know, but I won't ever send you away." Her voice trembled then, though her words did not. "Then I'll never leave." That night they lay close in the cot, the fire warm behind them. Calder held her, her head against his chest, and for the first time, neither thought of exile or grief. They thought only of the vow unspoken but clear. Whatever came down that ridge, they would face it together. The night after the riders left, the cabin was hushed but not hollow. Calder banked the fire, checked the rifle once more, then lay down beside Tala. She tucked her head beneath his jaw, his arm heavy across her back. Neither spoke, but both listened, the wind pressing at the windows, the faint creak of timbers in the cold. Fear was there, yes, but so was something stronger. Their silence no longer meant dread, it meant vow. The words had been spoken plain enough on the porch for both of them to feel it still. "She's mine now." And though the threat of return hung in the dark, Tala's breathing slowed against him, steady, certain. For the first time, she let herself believe she would not be cast aside again. When morning came, the world outside was blanketed in new snow, thick and muffling, as though the earth itself wanted to soften what had passed. Calder rose before the sun, his limp sharp in the cold, and set out to check the trap lines. Tala watched from the doorway, arms wrapped in his coat, until his figure disappeared into the trees. She boiled water, scrubbed the table with a wet rag, and swept the floor clean, each stroke of the broom steadying her nerves. She was not waiting anymore. She was preparing. Calder returned with 2 rabbits, snow clinging to his coat. He shook it off at the door and dropped the game on the table. "Empty snare, too," he muttered, jaw tight. She nodded, taking the rabbits in hand, her movements quick and practiced. The work steadied her, the scent of fresh blood, the clean rhythm of the knife. Calder watched her once, just long enough to see the surety in her hands, then set to chopping wood outside. For the first time in years, his cabin was not his burden alone. As days passed, their rhythm deepened. She no longer hovered at the edges of the space. She moved through it as though she belonged. She wore his shirt most days, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hem falling loose against her thighs. Her dress, mended neat, hung by the window, but she seldom touched it. Calder found himself noticing, not with hunger, but with the quiet recognition that she was no longer a shadow drifting through his life. She was part of it. At night they shared the cot without question. His hand found her waist, hers his chest, and both slept deeper than they had in years. Yet peace did not last long on the ridge. One afternoon the snow had calmed enough for Tala to stand at the woodpile, splitting kindling when she heard it. Hoofbeats again, slower this time, deliberate. Calder was inside, mending a hinge on the trapdoor. He froze, head turning toward the sound. A lone rider appeared through the trees, brown duster, slouched hat, shotgun across the saddle. He dismounted without knocking, eyes sharp as he scanned the clearing. Tala stepped onto the porch, hatchet still in her hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firm, though her stomach tightened. The man studied her, gaze narrowing. "You're Ridge's woman." He didn't wait for her answer. "Where is he?" Calder stepped from the trees then, axe over one shoulder, his limp all but forgotten in the urgency of his stride. His voice cut through the cold. "That's far enough." The man raised his palms. "Easy. I ain't here to cause trouble." Calder set down the axe, hand shifting toward the revolver beneath his coat. "You're standing on my land. Say what you came to say." The stranger tipped his hat. "Name's Danner. Rode with a trader once. She knew your wife, owed her a debt, never paid it. Maybe this evens it." He glanced at Tala. "Word in town is they're talking about rounding up the wild girls hiding in the hills." "Thought you ought to know." Calder's jaw tightened. "Why tell me?" Danner shrugged. "Don't care about you." But a debt's a debt. He tipped his hat again, mounted up, and rode off, leaving silence heavy behind him. Inside, Tala faced Calder by the fire. "Okay, rounding up?" she asked, her voice low. His eyes met hers, steady. "When folks get scared, they look for someone to blame. They'll look to you." She swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" He sat at the table, began cleaning his rifle. "We prepare." That night they worked side by side, blades and steel between them. She sharpened his knife until it gleamed, her hands sure. He checked the rifle twice over, then loaded it, laying it within reach of the door. They did not speak of fear, but when their eyes met, it was plain. They would not face it alone. Before bed, Calder spoke again, voice low. "If they come, I won't let them take you." Tala set down the knife, her fingers trembling. "They'll say you're hiding me. That you've chosen me." He met her eyes, unflinching. "I have." Her throat tightened, tears burning. "You're not afraid of what you'll lose." His voice came steady as iron. "I've lived alone a long time. I don't want to live that way anymore." She crossed to him then, knelt beside his chair, and took his hand in hers. "You said you lost everything once," she whispered. "So did I. Maybe that means we've got nothing left to lose." He shook his head, squeezing her hand. "No, it means we finally got something to protect later." They lay close, her head against his chest, his arm around her back. The fire glowed low, shadows flickering across the walls. The ridge outside was heavy with silence, but inside they had already chosen. Whatever came from Salt Creek, from riders, from town, they would face it together. Not strangers, not bargains, but man and woman, bound by choice. The ridge did not sleep easy. The fire burned low, their bodies tangled in the cot, but both Calder and Tala lay half awake, ears tuned to the weight of silence pressing against the cabin walls. Danner's warning had settled in them like stone. The town was stirring, voices carrying word of roundups, of wild girls being blamed for every trespass, every bruise, every fear a white man couldn't name. Tala's hand lay across Calder's chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. She did not ask if he believed the riders would return. She knew he did. And he knew she would not run. That unspoken vow was heavier than the rifle leaned against the wall. It was what steadied them. At dawn, the dogs from the valley barked sharp, their echoes bouncing up the frozen slopes. Calder was already at the window, rifle in hand, when Tala swung her legs over the cot. She pulled on his spare boots, laced them tight, and wrapped herself in his coat. Her face was pale but composed, eyes steady as she stood beside him. Outside, the sound of hooves cracked against the crust of snow. 4 riders this time, the red scarf man from before, the false sheriff. 2 more with rifles slung casual but ready. Calder stepped onto the porch, limp hard but steady, rifle gripped low but certain. "You're not welcome here," he said, voice flat as iron. The red scarf man grinned, teeth flashing cold. You harboring an Apache girl, Ridge? Calder's jaw clenched. No one here you need to talk to but me. The man tipped his head, mock pity in his eyes. We'll take a look around then. Calder shifted his weight, rifle lifting. You won't. The air thickened, cold sharp enough to cut. Horses stamped. Fingers twitched near triggers. Then the door opened behind him. Tala stepped out, chin lifted, dark hair tied back, coat tight around her shoulders. I'm here, she said, clear. Her voice carried steady into the frozen air. Calder turned, eyes flashing, but she laid her hand on his arm. It's all right. She faced the riders, unflinching. I was one of the wild ones. Not anymore. I've hurt no one. I live here. That's all. The red scarf man chuckled low. Living here now, huh? That what you call shacking up with a trapper? Calder stepped forward, rifle raised just enough to matter. You done? The grin faded. She's not your kind. Calder's eyes burned steady. She's mine now. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the restless shifting of horses. The false sheriff scowled. You know what kind of trouble you're inviting, Ridge. You've got neighbors, trade, what little reputation you still hold. You ready to give all that up? Calder's voice cut him short. I gave it up when my wife died. I don't owe this town anything. The men shifted, muttered, but none stepped closer. The red scarf man spat into the snow. Ain't worth bleeding over, but she'll be marked. Sooner or later, someone else will come. Calder's voice hardened, rifle steady in his grip. Then they better come ready. The riders turned, their horses carrying them slow back down the ridge, but their eyes lingered long enough to promise it wasn't finished. Calder held his stance until the last hoofbeat faded, then lowered the rifle. Tala's hand slipped from his arm, her breath shaking, but her chin remained high. You didn't have to do that, she whispered once they were alone. Calder turned to her, eyes steady. I know. She swallowed, voice trembling. You could have told them I was gone. His answer was plain. I won't ever do that. Inside, she hung his coat by the fire, then turned back to him. Her hands reached for his chest, pressing against the rough wool of his shirt. Her eyes burned bright. You said I'm yours. He nodded once. I meant it. She leaned closer, her breath warm against him. Then I'm yours. And you're mine. His reply came not in words, but in the kiss that followed, slow and steady, sealing what had already been forged in fire and snow. That night they lay close in the cot, their bodies warm beneath the heavy blanket. Calder brushed her hair back from her face, studying her as if memorizing every line. You think they'll come back? She asked, voice low. Probably. He pressed his forehead against hers. And if they do, we face it together. Tala closed her eyes, letting the truth of it settle. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled barefoot through the snow, begging not to die. She was no longer the exile, with shame heavy on her shoulders. She was his by choice, and he was hers. Later, as the fire burned low, they made love again, not out of hunger or fear, but because it was theirs to choose. Their hands moved slow, their breaths steady, the silence between them carrying more weight than words. Afterward, Tala lay with her head against Calder's shoulder, his hand covering hers where it rested on his chest. She whispered almost to herself, You think they'll ever understand? Calder shook his head once. Don't matter if they do. By spring, the snow had begun to loosen its grip on the land. Patches of black soil appeared between the drifts. Rivers swelled with runoff, and birds returned to the trees. Life crept back into the valley, slow but certain. Inside, the cabin Life had already returned. The table no longer bore the dust of neglect, but the marks of use. Bowls set side by side, tools mended, clothes folded neat. The cot no longer felt like a stranger's bed, but theirs. Calder's limp remained, but his steps carried strength he hadn't felt in years. Tala moved with assurance, her hum carrying through the cabin like a hymn. One evening, she stood barefoot in the doorway, sleeves rolled, the wind tugging at her hair. Calder sat at the table behind her, hands steady as he sanded the edge of a small pine cradle. She turned, eyes catching on his work. "You almost done?" she asked, voice soft. He looked up, brushing sawdust from his palms. "Another hour," she smiled faintly. "It doesn't need to be perfect." His eyes lingered on hers. "It does to me." She stepped closer, pressing a hand to her belly. "I'm late," she whispered. Calder rose slowly, his limp heavy, and placed his hands on her waist. "I figured." Her eyes filled, but she smiled through it. "You're not afraid?" His answer was steady, the same as it had always been. "No, I want you here. I want the child here too." She leaned into him, her face against his chest. And for the first time in years, the ridge felt less like exile and more like home. Spring came slow that year, as if the land itself had to be convinced to breathe again. The snow retreated in patches, leaving black earth and slick mud behind. But the rivers swelled with strength and the trees shook free of their winter burden. Birds returned in cautious song. Squirrels darted from branch to branch, and the ridge, once smothered in silence, hummed again with life. Calder and Tala stood at the cabin's edge side by side, watching the thaw spread like fire across the valley. For months they had weathered hunger, cold, and the weight of men's threats. But now, with the season turning, they felt something more permanent taking root. The cradle stood finished by the window, plain pine sanded smooth, no ornament but strong in its shape. Calder had carved it with the same care he gave his rifles and traps, every corner exact, every surface rubbed clean. It was not just wood, it was his vow, shaped by hands that had once only known how to hold loss. Tala traced the edge with her fingers, eyes burning with quiet tears. "You built this for us," she whispered. Calder stood behind her, his hands steady on her waist. "I built it because I believe in what's coming." Tala's belly had begun to change, the faintest curve where new life stirred. She wore it not with fear, but with quiet pride. She had walked into this cabin half dead, blood on her feet, shame pressed into her voice. Now she walked across its floor with shoulders straight, her hum filling the space like a blessing. She had not only survived, she had chosen, and Calder, who once thought grief had ended him, had found himself building again, not just walls and traps, but a future. The men from Salt Creek had not returned. Perhaps the ridge's silence had swallowed their anger, or perhaps Calder's stand had been enough. Still, he kept the rifle near the door, and each evening he checked the windows, the woodpile, the traps, not out of fear, but out of duty. "If they come back," he said one night, "they'll find us ready." Tala nodded, her hand resting over his. We faced them together. Their rhythm deepened into something that no longer felt like survival, but like life itself. Calder dug fence posts for a corral, his limp slowing him but never stopping him. Tala carried water from the stream, her steps steady despite the weight she bore within. They planted beans and squash in the small patch of thawed ground, the soil rich from melted snow. He worked the earth with careful precision. She knelt beside him, hands stained with dirt, laughter slipping past her lips in rare bursts. For Calder, the sound was worth more than the crop crops themselves. At night they sat with the fire, shoulders pressed, bowls of stew between them. Sometimes they spoke of the past, her exile, his loss. But more often they spoke of what lay ahead, the child, the crops, the simple work of keeping the ridge alive. I used to think I was finished, Calder admitted once, voice low. Like the war and her death had taken the last of me. Tala touched his hand. I used to think I had nothing left to give. But look at us now. He turned his eyes to hers, blue and steady, and saw, not the ghost of what he had lost, but the flame of what he had found. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide. It had become a home. The cot was no longer his bed or hers, but theirs. The table bore marks from their hands, the floor the sweep of her broom, the stove the scent of meal shared. Even the silence had changed. Once it had been the weight of grief pressing against the walls. Now it was space, space to breathe, to build, to belong. One evening, as dusk fell golden across the ridge, Tala leaned against him on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder. Deer moved in the distance, their shapes quiet against the trees. Do you ever think how close I came to dying out there? She asked softly. Calder's arm tightened around her. I think about it every day. She smiled faintly. And you let me in. He shook his head, pressing his lips to her hair. I just knew I couldn't shut the door. The fire inside the cabin glowed warm that night, shadows flickering against walls that had once echoed hollow. Tala lay with her hand over her belly, Calder's hand covering hers, both silent, but both knowing the truth. They were no longer two broken souls surviving alone. They were a family, bound not by blood, but by choice. When the first shoots of green broke through the earth outside, Tala stood barefoot in the doorway, sun on her face. Her hum carried on the breeze. Calder worked at the fence line, pausing to watch her, his heart steady with something he had thought long lost, hope. He lifted a hand, and she lifted hers in return. No words were needed. The ridge had given them back to themselves. So it ended not with vows shouted to the heavens, but with quiet acts repeated each day. A comb drawn through her hair. A cradle sanded smooth. A rifle kept steady by the door. A meal shared at the table. Small things, yet together they built something greater than either had known. They had chosen each other. And in that choice, they had found what the world had sworn to deny them, not just survival, but belonging.